I'll see how I compare this.
I was pushing for something that would guarantee you would get signals, as opposed to guarantee that you would get interpretable differential signals. Yeah,
I get to show a picture at least. So,
How
how do you want to do that? Yours is USB-C, right?
Yeah.
I can do mine on the VGA.
Well, so anyway,
Yeah.
mine might be in terms of like, that I had a subject that we can.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Okay.
well, we can do something.
I sent it to you, sent it to Allison.
I have to.
I'll post it on Facebook.
Small.
My head,
Yeah. It's,
her head is small.
her head is small, yeah, so I don't know. We ordered a smaller neck, but I don't know if it's small enough. So we just nab her as soon as.
Well, do you have somebody who you want to say on Saturday to try something, or?
Yeah, just look. How old is she now?
Maybe 8.5.
Yeah. Yeah, I think she's small.
Well, next time,
Did
did you send it to me?
At this point, 8.5 weeks, definitely.
Yeah,
We're-
to your
we're
like
looking at-
Gmail.
That's for typical 3-month-olds. So that's.
Allison can take care of it. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
So it's like, and there's just a lot of change.
Yeah,
through
okay,
that
so then
age.
let's just wait till next time.
Yeah.
And how
Yeah,
many?
these things cost $3,000 a pop, so it's like, the nets. It's kind of like, I don't have all sizes.
Would it be, well, do they even make them for that small, or?
They do, they make them for greenies,
Hmm.
even. There's some super small ones, neonates, they make neonate ones. They're probably 2 or 3 sizes below the size of our smallest size. They're probably a total of 11 sizes.
Well, maybe. Well,
Let me
Yeah,
check
because,
the
I think,
size and maybe.
my
you
first
can
slide
measure
is
it.
black.
Do you have a tape?
It's like,
Yeah,
it should
yeah,
be
just
black.
like-
Just like,
Yeah, check the sizes, I'll measure it,
yeah,
and
and then we can see
see.
where we're at.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Because I would just love to.
Yeah, have something to go with that, yeah, exactly, especially if you get a 1 to 2 month point extra long.
So the NIH one, but I will bring the subject.
Yeah, right.
Works. It does.
Nice.
Damn, the review.
It looks a
was
little-
stupid.
little low.
You just have to wait a few years for N equals 2, but. We'll get something in the meantime.
Well, I think we should
Get some
really
lead
get
in
some
it.
work.
Yeah.
It's a little precarious.
It is precarious. I'm probably gonna just be like this the whole time.
No post.
But, yeah.
I mean,
But I'm
it's
really
pretty good,
looking forward to getting
but it
this
is
month.
precarious.
Do you have, family, people coming?
Anatomical.
They're at Cooper right now.
I'm still trying to
He
figure out
does have
exactly
family.
what to do with
He
it.
has family, yeah.
Yeah.
I have some of those.
They here for the weekend or?
Yeah, they came last week.
Uh,
They came for the stressful time.
It's just for that.
Not stressful time. It's an interesting choice.
Huh? Right? It's working, okay.
Welcome.
Or something.
Is that actually like a special stamp?
Not for chairs, but it's just like,
Just-
Oh, I
this,
see.
is, this is my family.
Oh, hi.
This is my mom.
Nice to meet you.
Do you know Allison?
Yeah.
This is my sister.
Hi, I'm Justin.
Nice to meet you, Justin.
And Adam is my sister's
It's
fiance.
funny, your dad left to come here first.
Nice.
Oh, okay, got it.
the obvious
So we're
explanation.
under strict orders not to ask questions.
Is there like?
Yes,
Sorry.
questions.
Yeah.
Checking my email regularly.
That was the way for me to get it to you
Sure.
and Dan and me.
Let me see,
I have no idea how to message it to me. I had to post on Facebook. Right now, it's a really exciting live
Tea or is
stream.
there only coffee?
Just coffee.
Only coffee, Dad.
Only coffee.
How could you? How inconsiderate.
Reasonable breakfast option.
Yeah.
It's a scam.
Selective
So
attention.
just is it your first?
First graduate student, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Alright.
Set the bar high.
Cameron already graduated.
That's true. Yeah, I
Does
mean,
that
but
weird,
that he took over one graduate student.
We see what you mean.
The first graduate student that went through the whole thing.
It's just streamed to the world.
No, yeah, right. So-
Cameron's
Empty.
You know what I mean, like the first, you know.
Yeah, I forwarded this to my housemates too.
Yeah.
To Andrew. Do you have that mention?
I don't have to.
So you can also be forwarded that, I guess.
I don't care either.
Like looking into the past.
Watching the stream. Yeah, it's pretty funny.
What are you streaming to?
YouTube.
YouTube?
Look, Dan's over there.
Oh,
Look,
it's-
over there. It's delayed.
It's delayed.
Delayed by.
Is it delayed on purpose?
Thanks.
Or is
I
it
don't
just where
know.
it is?
I don't know. It's delayed by
So I can
15
step in
seconds.
in case, yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah. That way you
I'm
can get
guessing
it-
it's
We use
both.
bad language or something. It cuts
Yeah,
it.
exactly. It's a family-friendly event.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be open to kids of all ages. Remember that, Dan?
What's up?
No bad language.
No bad language.
No bad language.
What does that mean?
I don't know. Whatever bad language is. You know what it is. I know.
Oh, that's the streaming?
Yeah.
Oh. Is it meant to sit like that?
Is this?
It's like made for.
No.
Oh.
It's improv. I'm like MacGyver.
Yeah, especially from the front, it looks like you have something like particularly made for that.
That's a sign of a good improvisation. I have like one of those gorilla like things for my phone.
Oh, yeah.
Those like curly things.
Yeah, they also kind
But
of fall over now.
They're okay. They're okay.
Yeah.
But I didn't get the iPad one because I was like, I'm never gonna use my iPad for this. And
Now you need it, yeah.
okay. Cool.
Hey, I'm gonna sit on this side.
Are you guys? You don't know. Have you submitted your stuff? I mean your draft.
Okay, that's how I climb
All of Nura.
Oh, okay, all neurons,
Oh, is it?
Anna and Zayna were doing it on the same day.
yeah. Yeah, I know.
What?
Ian and I were not quite that coordinated.
Uh-huh.
Oh, you're taking a right?
It also seemed like too much.
You're
the first person who said that
gave me the same reaction.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that's.
Because you're on this committee too, right?
Yeah.
I'm on.
It's the only option.
You're not on this.
Allows that stress to continue for many months.
Told you to go places and I go.
That sounds totally workable. That sounds great. No, dude. Hmm? Am I done? Like with my draft? I submitted my draft to I read it almost immediately. Not fast, like too tiny.
Hopefully not
Like I said,
additional
like
comments.
one sentence was like, you know, you might make use of this or this or simply theoretical expertise. It's like simply here is really undermining, like, yeah, and keep you right. So it looks simply, that's the level.
It wasn't terrible. I've seen worse. Like,
Yeah. Well, the worst one was our.
Oh yeah, that's right. The table of the
Sideways table.
That was interesting. Yeah.
I can see the. Oh my God. I don't know how they did it.
So you guys are
Like, I don't know how.
Oh, you are.
They formatted it.
It's like a special thing that you have to do in the software.
It's fairly complicated.
This is just so cool.
So I think one of the reviewers for your paper
Did they?
yeah.
Well, I'm a little stressed, but like I can keep it down to like support things.
I forgot.
Two of you.
And I'm not clear what they're.
Johnny, would you like to see? I can't block the iPad.
Wave flag.
Absolutely. Well, how are you doing? Today, it's well,
Hello.
I brought my,
You're not gonna wear shoes for your
I brought my
defense?
wife and then my arms.
I was wondering about that.
Kalani, I'm actually going to use this chair and the chair head
Okay.
for videotaping.
Live
Can I
streaming.
see it?
Yes.
Sit here?
Yeah. Want to move down?
That's the move, to the corner.
It's my job.
People are gonna be tweeting all over.
So
Watching
it's
on
done-
stream.
it's done now. Yeah.
This is such an old school room. Where did you find this room? I didn't know that rooms like this existed.
This room has windows.
No, I'm fine with windows, but the chairs, like they've been here since the 40s or
No,
what?
no, these
Heard
are
that there was like
quite modern.
buzzing, and it was email on my back.
This is a TV? I'm glad I didn't go here.
Especially because we commented on Dan's appearance. Or something like you
They didn't invent plastic years on the 40s?
See that this building.
I mean, our building is a little older, right?
The building.
I also may have found like apartment hunting. That fell through in spectacular fashion, and a people that I was supposed to room with instead
I don't know if the psychology
but their landlord ended up saying, actually, there's this other place. So they accepted it as well. And we'll have to leave in September. The bright line for that for me is I am house hunting out with one of those guys. And we did some place in Victoria Hill. So yesterday, we're applying right now. Right between, it's not like, unfortunately, it's not like just a block away from like the King Street area. But it's on King Hill, with the mission on one side and the trail on the other. So it's quite certain. It's a little annoying that it really hasn't been easy to use for getting to the mission. You know, even if you live there, it's still has a ridiculous.
My summer on
So if you want to go to class during the
It's kind of baby.
we can go there. We can put your.
I was there in the beginning.
Just like you want. Maybe a little love. It's a summer.
Franco, what are you doing here? Next time I see you in Rome.
It's an unofficial business.
Okay.
You should not say anything bad about Dan.
Or anything too good.
You shouldn't say anything too good either. We want to be impartial. Dan is neutral. I have no strong opinions.
You just like a puppy. Is Josiah allowed?
Yeah.
Is that working out good?
Wait, so I forgot. Is this an average or
Like I said, I think it's a little low.
Kind of deciding the projects in the first go.
It is a lot of people.
So how
I think it looks. I think it's great.
I leave tomorrow night.
For a good time.
Maybe, yeah.
I have a- I do have a
I hope
preference,
not.
right? But yeah, like if I'm sold, I have to go right now. I
And
would do
then
it.
It takes you 2 hours actually.
Yeah, don't say shit.
Now you have to do it one way.
I'm just gonna pour this down. I'll be really soon.
Everything's okay. Live. People watching from afar. I'm gonna. Just don't want to
Are
do
you
it.
are you like streaming this on live on the internet?
This is live online. It's the new age.
No, we did that for Jesse also.
No, I know. It's not really the new like.
For Michael, and then Michael started to do a texting mode that Jesse puts a water bottle, put it there in front of the camera.
Yeah.
And then the mother started getting text.
Where are you streaming?
On YouTube. Yeah.
Thursday morning live.
So people are watching this the first of all.
Yeah, I suppose. I think it probably would be just as effective for me to just record the thing and delay by 1 hour, just post it. But you know, the novelty of like seeing it right at the time. That's
I
nice.
think if you have friends who are engaged, that's like watching like a football game when it's happening,
Yeah,
or an
absolutely.
hour later, right?
Yeah. That's why we're doing
Do
it.
you know how many people are online?
I have no idea.
You don't know?
I have never done this before, and I am using some kind of third-party app.
I can confirm at least 2 people.
You can?
Where?
I sent
Oh,
it to them
oh.
and they texted me, they're like, and they repeated back something that I said.
Oh yeah, that's a good
Let's
test.
see.
You can
It
write
says
some.
how many people are watching.
Can you comment on the video and see
Well, I'm
who?
watching now. So I guess there's only one person watching.
And that was probably me.
Water bottle, Jesse, I can't see.
I don't see my
Have it open in a tab and you're just listening, because I count as watching.
Oh, no. Two watching.
Whose arm is that? That's not live.
It went to the other education building. This is like the email that says, it's like, that one's
I mean, it's delayed by about 15 seconds.
Okay, thank you all for coming today to Dan Berman's thesis defense. So I have some prepared comments because there's a lot of things I need to get off my chest. I want to make sure I get through all those things here. So Dan Berman was the first graduate student brave enough to join my lab when I joined the department, psychology department here 5 years ago. And what people will say to you about working here at Stanford is that it's a real privilege to work with amazing students that come to Stanford, and Dan really set the bar very high for what an amazing student Stanford can be. So I've been very privileged to work with Dan for the last 5 years and be his mentor. Dan came to the department having worked in Berlin with the well-known group of John Dylan Haynes on the point of no return in decision making. So early on, we discussed what he might do for his first-year project here in the psychology department. So Dan had some modest goals for himself. He wanted to solve consciousness, I think. Is that the discussion that we were having? And you know, I'm kind of an overly cautious person, so I was a little bit worried about the scope of that first-year project. So we talked a lot over the years. And I have to say, this is the kind of conversation that as a mentor you're really happy to have with a student, because Dan listened to what he would come to call my history lessons, sort of important, the history of what's happened before. And he would challenge me when something didn't sit right with him, but he would also accept and rethink if on occasion I said something that made some sense. So it's been really a great intellectual experience having Dan in the lab in all the interactions that we have. I always look forward to the conversations, scientific conversations that we've had over the past few years. I hope we'll continue to have those conversations. Dan ended up with still what I think you'll see is quite an ambitious project. So Dan's not one who just has sort of empty ambitions. He's someone who works really, really hard to get those things accomplished. He worked really hard over the years that he's been here. For one thing, we realized at one point that to achieve the goals of his project, he had to go back and make some really basic sensory measurements, which was a lot of work, I think, and he just went back and did that. And he published that last year in the Journal of Neurophysiology. From there, I think he's built what I think I hope you'll appreciate as being a very beautiful scientific story. And I'll let Dan tell you the story himself. But it has to do with using linking models to understand cortical mechanisms of attention. I think after all the dust is cleared on this and all the work that you've done, I don't know whether we've solved consciousness, but I do think you've made some real deep progress into the questions I think you came into graduate school wanting to answer. This has turned into, I think, a very nice contribution that Dan has made, and it's been accepted for publication in Nature Communications. It's set to come out next week, Monday or something. So along with his research, Dan has been a devoted and really passionate educator who has touched, I think, the lives of many undergraduate and graduate students in this university. Dan was the first TA to help me teach Introduction to Cognitive Neuroscience, which is a large lecture course, which is sort of the first point of contact for students at this university interested in cognitive neuroscience. And he wanted this first experience for cognitive science for undergraduates to be both really rigorous and fun. And we brainstormed about how to make cognitive neuroscience come to life, and he ended up doing a lot of really adventurous things that I think have made a huge difference. First thing he did was he TM'd with fellow TA in front of 200 undergraduate students. He taught undergraduates the action potential by recording from and stimulating the legs of cockroaches. He built beautiful computer simulations of neurons during decision making and attention, and something about squirrels and apples and trees that had something to do with reinforcement. I should say, again, this wasn't easy. This was a huge amount of work and effort that Dan put into this. He really believed in the goals of teaching and trying to get people excited about that. I think that really has paid off. I think the first year was a lot of work, and I begged a lot of the graduate student TAs to come back, and most of them, I think, smartly decided not to come back, but Dan came back and worked many years over this time and really made the course, I think, made a huge difference in making the course really, really, really good. So I'm really grateful for having you as my teaching partner over those years, and I don't know how to do it without you. I'll just show one slide here of Dan, that's Dan giving a lecture, so you can see sort of Dan in his element. I don't know exactly what you were doing there, but the students were all engaged. And of course, like everything that Dan does, he had to be doing that barefoot. I don't really know why. We've discussed it over the years, but Dan won't tell me why he has to do it. Okay, so Dan has won 2 teaching awards for his time here. I think really well deserved. The most recent one was the Walter G. Goris Award, which is a university-wide award. And I should say that I think that I, of course, supported him in his nomination, but I think it's really important to know that the nomination really came from his fellow graduate students and other undergraduates who really wanted to see him get that award. And I think that's really important to note because it speaks to Dan's sort of leadership qualities and his sort of infectious enthusiasm for wanting to teach and do high-level education and science. He won that award in part for, quote, unquote, helping his fellow PhDs grow as teachers through his management of the teaching team and for developing coursework that routinely exceeds student expectations. I think that was very well deserved. So it's been a great privilege to be your mentor over the past few years. I admire your positive attitude, your energy, your enthusiasm, the clarity you have about what is right and what is wrong. Sometimes, you're not always right about things. I also admire your impatience at times with wanting to get things done. I think you are best when you put that energy into building what you believe is right, and with it bring up others in your vision for doing great science and education. I'm really excited to see you I'm really excited to see what you'll achieve next. You have a postdoc lined up at the University of Washington with Nick Steinmetz. I think I'm really excited to see the amazing, incredible things that I'm sure that you will do. I think neuropexels in mouse is going to be a really amazing thing for you to do. But I don't want you to get sucked up into the mouse world. I want you to come back at some point and continue working in neuroscience for life. After that, I'll give you.
Thanks for the intro. So today I'm going to tell you all about human selective visual attention and a little bit about the work that I've done trying to figure out how selective visual attention is implemented in the brain. So to start off, I'd like to use a demo to give you an intuition for what kinds of, what selective attention should feel like for you. And the intro we're going to use is going to involve black-capped chickadees, which are a bird that is endemic in North America. And you might, or I might soon be sitting in Seattle in an office with a nice view of the Seattle skyline. Actually, my office faces another building, so it won't look like this. But you could imagine being bored one day and maybe birds will be flying by and you might count them. So what I'd like you to do now is focus on the black-capped chickadees that are going to fly by and just count how many of them pass the office window here. You have to ignore the robins and the condors, of course. So I find this kind of task, there's some chuckles. I find this task fascinating because of what has to happen in your brain for you to pull out that information and be able to achieve the goal that I set for you, counting how many of those things passed. And while you were doing that, you pulled out information about those yellow birds, and you might have lost some information about the rest of the scene. So in this case, you may not have noticed that the Berlin TV tower is fairly out of place in Seattle. Also, Mount Rainier is huge. It's really a big mountain. It's also there's sunset happening on one side. So there are changes that happened in this scene. There's actually a lot of them that happened. And you missed them because you were focused. You were paying attention to one aspect of the visual scene. You lost access to this other piece of the scene. So just so you can see the whole thing again, I'm going to flip the image back to what it looked like originally. And I'm going to play this whole animation again. So this time, you can pay attention to the whole scene and see these changes as they're happening. And you'll see that actually the mountain appearing in the background and the tower are very obvious things that you missed because you shifted your attention to one aspect of the scene and not the others. So this is what I'm interested in understanding. How does this work in the brain? And to do that, we're going to think about a number of different questions. For one thing, we're going to think about how visual areas represent these kinds of stimuli. We're also going to think about how decision-making areas read out those representations from the sensory areas. And we're going to do this by looking at how behavior works, just what just happened, what you were doing, what kinds of clues does that give us about the implementation of attention. And we're also going to use what Justin alluded to, linking models, to connect behavior and the representations in the brain and understand how they're connected to each other. To give you a full roadmap for where we're going today, I'm going to start by telling you about a first project in which we looked at how behavior, when you're selecting information from scenes, is related to bias and sensitivity, and I'll define those terms in a moment. Then we'll talk about a framework that took us a long time to build, looking at how motion visibility is represented in visual cortex. And in the last part of the talk, I'll link that framework to behavior to understand how does selection work? How is information pulled out from visual representations during behavior? And I'll try to connect these two ideas together. I think they point towards sort of one view of how attention might work in the brain. And I'll tell you about that at the end. So to get started, I want you to think about what you selected from the scene you just saw. You pulled out objects, these yellow chickadees, mostly probably based on their color. There's other ways that you can pull information out of a scene. So if you keep your eyes still, you can imagine breaking the visual field into two halves. And you can imagine attending or focusing on things that are just on one side. It's a form of spatial selection. There's other kinds of features that exist in the world. One we're going to talk about later is motion. So the first question that I want to tell you about, and I've been thinking about for a number of years, is how well does selection work? How well can you pull out different kinds of features from these scenes? And to answer that, I want to show you the kind of task that we use in the psychophysics lab, in Justin's lab, actually. So in all of our tasks, we have a fixation cross. We ask people to keep their eyes still. And that's to break up the scene into two halves so you can select things by spatial location. So I'm going to have you do that now. Keep your eyes still on this cross. And what you'll see are going to be two patches on the left and two patches on the right filled with dots. And the dots are going to have different colors. There will be 4 different colors, and I want you to try to memorize all of them. Here's the color. Hopefully you got that. And what I ask people to do in the lab after they see these kinds of scenes is to recall one of the 4 colors that they saw. So for example, think now, what color were the dots on the left that were going upward? And hopefully you remember, some of you probably remember, those of you who were focused on that side, that the dots were orange. And that's the kind of information we might ask people to give us. And this stimulus that I just showed you, this is a caricature of the same thing you just saw. So on the left, there were dots going up and down, 2 different colors, and on the right, dots going up and down, 2 different colors. This stimulus is useful because we can use it to select information in different ways, just like I described before. So one way that you can select information here is by side. I could have you memorize the colors on one side or on the other side, and then I could ask you about one of those at a time. And that would be a form of spatial selection. I could also ask you to select the colors that are moving in the same direction, either upward or downward. And that would be a form of what we call feature-based selection, in this case selecting by motion direction. To compare these different forms of selection, we need to put them on sort of the same metric. And the metric we're going to use is how consistent you are at reporting the color that you were asked to report about. So let's imagine that you memorized a patch that was red, so the actual color was red. You might make mistakes and be off a little bit if you were to report that color on this color wheel. If we had you do that over and over many times, we would find some variability in what colors you report. And the spread of your responses is your sensitivity in this task. So for example, if all of your responses are clustered together near the target color, then you would be very good at this task, you'd be sensitive. And if all the colors were sort of, your reports were distributed all around the color wheel, you would be doing badly at this task. And in the extreme, if you're just guessing on every single trial, you'd have a uniform distribution around this space. So that's the measure we're going to use. And I want you to just experience a little bit what this feels like. So I'm going to ask you to memorize the 2 dot patches that are on the right. Remember, you're keeping your eyes still, so you're using your peripheral vision to do this. So the 2 dot patches on the right side. And hopefully you can remember now that the dots going up on the right were some kind of light blue color. And that should be easier than the task you did at the beginning where you had to remember all 4. So spatial selection gives you some advantage. This time I'd like you to select the dot patches based on their feature. So memorize the 2 that are moving downwards. And again, at the end of these kinds of tasks, we always ask people to report about 1. So what was the color on the left? And hopefully you remember that it was some kind of dark blue color. And that experience should feel a little different than selecting by side. These are different ways of selecting information, and the whole point of the talk is to figure out how does that work. So the full task that we use in the lab looks like this. It is exactly what you just did, but at the end you actually get to rotate a dial to make these reports. And in our experiments, we bring a small number of people into the lab, and we have them do a lot of data collection. And that's because we want to be confident about our results in each person who comes into the lab. So 7 people came in, they did this for 4 hours, which is a long time for a psychophysics or a psychology experiment, I guess. And what we found was that whether people queued by side or were queued by feature, their performance was similar. So here I'm showing you the target color that they were asked to report. They're all rotated so that they're upward. And this is the distribution of responses people made relative to that target color. And the 2 distributions here look very similar, regardless of what people were asked to do. I can take those distributions and unfold them as well. So here I'm showing you on the x-axis the distance around the circle from the target color, and on the y-axis the proportion of responses that people made. And hopefully you can see here that queuing by side and queuing by feature, motion direction, are very similar. There's no difference in sensitivity. Oh, sorry. To show that quantitatively, we're going to fit a simple model of sensitivity. The model fits one parameter, d prime, and these are examples of what different d primes would look like. If you can see that a low d prime is sort of guessing more or less, and a high d prime means people's responses are clustered near the target color. I'll show you those in this distribution as well. So high d prime, they're doing a good job of reporting the color that they were asked about, and a low d prime, they're basically guessing kind of randomly. When we use that d prime model to fit the data, we find that people who are queued to remember 4 dot patches and then asked about 1 at the end have a d prime of about 1. When they're queued spatially, their sensitivity improves. And when they're queued by feature, their sensitivity is similar to spatial. And in fact, when you do a statistical test, there's no difference between these. So queuing by side and queuing by feature have similar sensitivity. So back to this story here, selecting by these different features doesn't change your sensitivity, but this isn't the only way that you can make mistakes in this task. So another way you can make mistakes in this task is if I ask you about 1 dot patch, but you end up mistakenly reporting about a different one. And the reason that this might happen is because we make the task hard. So I made it easy for you, I gave you a lot of time. In the lab though, we give people a very brief time. So they're likely to make mistakes and errors where they confuse the different dot patches. We call this kind of error an error in bias. So you might be biased towards certain dot patches depending on the way that you're queued. So the 2 ways that you can make errors in these tasks, we're breaking them down here. Which dot patch did you report? We're calling that bias. And how well did you report that dot patch? We're calling that sensitivity. To collect data about both of these, we actually use a slightly different task. The details don't matter too much. There are more conditions that lets us fit these different parameters properly. We bring other people in. We have them do even more data collection for this experiment. Again, to be confident about our results in each observer because it comes into the lab. And to give you a sense of how this could play out, I want to give you some examples of how a change in bias might look. So if you're queued to the side, remember you're being asked to report about just the orange patch at the end, but you memorize these 2 at the beginning of the trial. You might find that people are good at this, but they make some proportion of the time they make an error and report about the other dot patch on the same side. So you memorized orange and blue. I asked you to tell me about the dots going upward, and you get confused and tell me about the ones that went down, the blue ones. When you're queued by feature, you might find something similar, but different in the sense that observers might occasionally report about the matched feature on the other side. So they memorized the 2 dot patches going up, they were orange and pink, and then they mistakenly, some percentage of the time, report about that pink dot patch instead of the orange one. So different ways that this could play out. I'm going to show you the actual data now. So what happens when observers are queued to the 4 dot patches and then report about 1 is that half the time they get this right. Remember, the task is hard. 40% of the time, they mistakenly report about the other dot patch on the side, it's the same side, and 11% of the time, they just get confused and report about the other dot patch. When we queue by side, we find that observers only make mistakes about that side. So in some sense, you could say that spatial selection is strong enough to knock out any memory of these other dot patches. But they still make a substantial number of errors on that side as well. Yeah, Dan, do you have a question?
Yeah. So how do you define task? Is it like a discrete task, or is that a continuous color wheel?
It's a continuous color wheel, so they're doing an estimation task.
Okay, so when you say they're right or they're wrong, is that like with some?
So the model has 2 stages here. First, we're basically sampling which dot patch are they reporting. And then the second step of the model is we're fitting a parameter that fits how sensitive they are, given that they reported about that dot patch. So in this case, it's like 28% of the time, observers were reporting about the blue dot patch, but then they also have some sensitivity in those reports.
So it's like,
Yeah. Okay, so what happens when you queue by direction? We find that observers make mistakes about all the dot patches. So there's a difference in the bias to report about different dot patches in this task between these 2 different ways of queuing. So to summarize what we've seen so far, selecting by these different features, in this case color, spatial location and motion direction, change your bias, but not your sensitivity. And we also do this task, the reason color's here is because we flip the features and do it for color as well. So we're confident that this is true in these all 3 of these different sets of features. So I think this result is interesting because of this difference between bias sensitivity. And I think these imply something about what's happening in the brain. The behavior tells something about what might be going on. And I think what it tells you is that if sensitivity had changed, then the representation in the brain would have had to become more precise or less precise in some way. If the bias is changing, all that needs to happen is a change in where you're pulling your information from, assuming that these different dot patches are represented separately in some way in the brain. And I want you to keep these ideas in mind because they're going to come back later in the talk. So we've compared some different kinds of selection. Yeah.
Should I be interpreting that statement to be a late selection model as opposed to, so this notion of where you're pooling?
This could, I think this is consistent with either an early selection model or a late selection model. Yeah. But we should think about that again at the end when we've gone through the linking model for the other task. So far I haven't told you anything about the brain specifically, and that's what I want to do in the next section. I want to think about how visual features are represented in the brain and how attention might pull them out. And we're going to be looking at a particular feature, motion visibility, in this section. So to do this and think about how attention functions in the brain, it would be nice to use the same features we just talked about. But actually when we started this project, we thought about using things like color, motion direction, we thought about using features like faces, but all of them are hard to find representations for in the human brain with functional imaging. So we ended up settling on a set of features that have to do with the visibility of motion. And I want to introduce them to you now. So one of the features is well studied. It controls the visibility of all images, and that's contrast. So in dots, contrast controls the relative brightness of the dots against a gray background. So here I'm increasing and decreasing the contrast and making these dots more or less visible. Their motion direction becomes visible and then disappears again each time they flip. So contrast, one feature that controls motion visibility, and coherence is another feature that can control the visibility of motion. Coherence here is the percentage of dots that are moving together in the same direction. These are 2 ways of controlling the visibility of a motion stimulus, and they're orthogonal from each other. I can manipulate one without manipulating the other. And that property makes these a good tool to study attention in dot motion, because we can ask you to look at contrast or coherence. I'm going to have you do that in just a moment. So we had observers watch these kinds of patches, and we put them in the MRI machine to measure their hemodynamic responses while they saw changes in the contrast and coherence to see how these features are represented in visual cortex. So I want you to see exactly what happened when people were in the scanner. So again, we had our observers staring at a fixation cross. That's important because it puts one dot patch into each side of the visual field. And what you're going to see come up are dots that are low contrast and are incoherently moving around. And then the dots are going to bump up in contrast and they're going to cohere. So they're going to all move together. So here they are at low contrast. There's the change. And each time one of these changes in contrast and coherence happens, what we're doing is measuring the response in visual cortex. So let me show you what those look like. We also measure different durations. And again, we bring in a relatively small number of people, but we have them do this for a long time. So we have good measurements in each subject who comes in to do this experiment. So what happens? I'm going to tell you about one particular retinotopic visual area, V1, and then we'll expand that to the full set of areas that we recorded from. So in V1, these are the kinds of measurements that we make. And I want to unpack this graph for you for a moment. So what you're looking at here on the x-axis is time passing after a change in the contrast or a change in the coherence. On the y-axis is signal change. The signal that we're measuring is the hemodynamic response, which is related to the concentration of the oxygenated hemoglobin. So when neural activity happens, it eats up oxygen in an area, and blood flow comes to replace that. And we're basically measuring the blood flow moving around in that area. That's why the lag is here is about 6 seconds before this response peaks. So what you're seeing here is that when the dots bump from a baseline contrast up 25, 50, or 75%, the response in V1, averaged across the whole area, also bumps up larger and larger. So you might say that V1 is sensitive to contrast. It cares about what contrast is shown on the screen. You can compare that to V1's response to coherence, which is the same regardless of what change in coherence happened on the screen. So V1 is an area that's sensitive to contrast, but insensitive to coherence. We didn't just measure changes in contrast in isolation, or changes in coherence in isolation. To build out this framework and understand these properties of visual cortex, we measured the full cross, so to speak. So all the combinations of contrast and coherence. And the reason we did this is we were interested in knowing whether contrast and coherence interact in some way. You'll notice we also measured various durations for some of these. And again, that's because duration also affects the visibility of motion. The more time you have to look at a motion stimulus, the better estimate you're going to have of where what direction the motion is moving in. So that's the picture for V1. We also measured other visual areas, like MT. MT is an area that's sensitive to coherence, but relatively insensitive to contrast. And we actually measured a whole bunch of retinotopic visual areas. This is one of the great advantages of using human neuroimaging, where we can get all of this data at the same time. So this is the full picture of how contrast and coherence affect visual cortex, changes in contrast and coherence. And what we wanted to do now was summarize this into a framework from which we can think about attention. So again, we're trying here to figure out how attention works, and we want to put this into a form where we can think about that. So what we're going to do is summarize the sensitivity of these responses into functions. So let me walk you through how that works. The idea is you take the amplitude of these responses. So this is the amplitude to the plus 25% contrast change. Remember, I'm just going to move that onto a different axis here. So here the axis is contrast on the x-axis and signal change on the y-axis. You should see that as contrast increases, the signal change in V1 increases as well. It's showing you what you saw before and exactly what's on the left side here. And what we're going to do is fit functions through that data. If the function has a positive slope, the area is sensitive to that property. We're going to do the same thing for coherence. We're going to pull out the responses at different coherences. And for V1, our expectation is that this is going to be flat. So V1 will be insensitive to coherence. The exact functions that I'm using here are functions that have somewhat of a history in the field. So the contrast response function is actually the Naka-Rushton function, which has been used to describe contrast for a long time. And the motion coherence function is a function that can interpolate between linear and a saturating exponential function. And that turned out to be important to fit our data well. So what happens when you fit these models? You find that it recapitulates what you saw before. V1 is sensitive to contrast, insensitive to coherence, and here are the other areas we measured. V2 through V4 are all areas that are more sensitive to contrast than coherence. And this area MT is the only area that's more sensitive to coherence than to contrast. Again, the dots here are the fits to the real data, and the functions are the lines going through them. So now we have a picture of how contrast and coherence, these two properties of motion visibility, are represented in visual cortex. And we can zoom out a little bit and start thinking, how does attention operate over these representations? Which is what we're going to do in the next part of the talk. So we answered this first question, and now we'd like to answer this second question. How do you pull out information about motion visibility? And to do that, I want to introduce you to the task that we had our participants do. So again, our participants are always fixating on crosses. The dot patches are going to appear exactly like they did before, and they're going to change in contrast again. But this time, one side is going to change more than the other. And I want you to tell me which side has that larger change in contrast. So the question you're answering is, which dot patch is higher contrast when the change happens? Let's do it. Here's the change. And hopefully you all saw that the right side was the higher contrast here. Let's do the same thing for coherence. So look for which side has the higher change in coherence. Change will come in a second. And hopefully again you saw that the right side, the dots were more coherent than the left. You might have been confused potentially this time because the contrast was higher on the left. And that was important for the task. We changed both the contrast and the coherence uncorrelated from each other so we can measure how people are sensitive to both of those. So that's the full task setup. We make this change, there's a short delay. The observers make a response, they tell us which side was which, and then we give them feedback on each trial. They're asked one of these two questions on each trial, which side's higher contrast or which side's higher coherence. And again, we bring in a ton of people. They do a ridiculous number of trials. I felt a little bad during this experiment for how long they were doing this. So this is the kind of data that we find. Let me unpack this graph for you. The x-axis here is the difference in contrast between the right and the left dot patch. So if you're way out here, this point is saying that the right dot patch was about 30% higher coherence than the left, and the observers were telling us that 100% of the time they were getting this correct. They're saying that the right side was higher contrast. It's not until the difference in contrast gets really small that they start making mistakes. So you can say here that when asked about which side's higher contrast, observers are sensitive, very sensitive, to differences in contrast. Because we had those uncorrelated changes in coherence, we can also measure the observer's sensitivity to that property. And we find that when asked about contrast, observers are insensitive to coherence. That's good. That means that they're ignoring the feature that they're not supposed to be reporting about. What happens when we ask them about coherence? A similar story comes out. They're sensitive to the coherence and insensitive to the contrast. 1% coherence is not equal to 1% contrast. So the fact that these slopes are different doesn't really mean, I wouldn't read into that too much. So that's the picture for the behavior. This is what people do in this task. And something we're curious about at this point is what happens to those sensory representations that we measure? What changes in that framework? So it turns out that, yeah?
I actually ask you, so psychologically, subjects presumably have much more confidence in their decisions when they're making about coherence than it is about contrast. And perhaps their reaction times are really faster with respect to coherence than with respect to, there's no interaction between these sort of differences in decline.
Yeah, so this is
signals that you're going to care about.
Yeah, so the question is whether there's differences in sort of the experience of responding about these two different features. So the detail I'm skipping here is that we're staircasing the task at all times to keep the difficulty constant at several different difficulties. So in theory, actually, these are comparable in some sense. The difficulty is controlled by the staircase. Okay, So what happens to the framework and the representations of contrast and coherence when people are asked about them? It turns out that they change. So when you're performing the contrast task compared to the coherence task, you become slightly more sensitive. This parameter here is one of the parameters in that Naka-Rushton function I showed you before, but I'm just showing you what it looks like in this little inset plot here. So observers are becoming more sensitive. Their slope is increasing when they're performing the contrast task. Their contrast sensitivity changed. That's good. That means that we might be able to explain what's happening in the behavior based on changes in sensitivity in visual cortex. It turns out that that's consistent across all the visual areas we measured. Observers are always more sensitive to contrast when they're performing the contrast task. That's also consistent with the response in MT. Observers are more sensitive to coherence in MT when they're performing the coherence task. That's an increase in the slope again. But that turns out to be inconsistent across the different areas. And I'd also point out that when you look at these changes here, they're quite small. The behavior I just showed you, there was a complete switch. The observers are going from being sensitive to contrast and insensitive to coherence to the opposite, sensitive to coherence and insensitive to contrast. And that's not the changes that you're seeing here. It's not like sensitivity drops to 0 in any of these conditions. There are small increments in the representation. So just to summarize what you just saw, when reporting about contrast, on average, the sensitivity to contrast is increasing, and the sensitivity to coherence might be decreasing, or it might just be sitting at 0. And the opposite's happening when you're reporting about coherence. Your sensitivity to contrast is going down, and your sensitivity to coherence is going up.
What if there was a per task? What if it was just fixation? Where would that lie?
So I actually showed you fixation before. And the data that I showed you just now was not relative to fixation, they're just relative to each other. So the fixation data is somewhere in the middle, basically. One thing to say about the fixation data is all the responses are actually lower, and we think that that might be sort of a spatial attention effect as you're switching from focusing on the fixation cross to focusing on the dot patches themselves. So this is the picture we have for what happens in the sensory representations when you're performing the task. And these are the kinds of changes that would change your sensitivity. If you think back to the beginning, when we were selecting information, sensitivity wasn't changing, but these are the kinds of changes that would result in a change in your sensitivity. So the last part here, I want to think about how selective attention actually reads out information from those representations. And I've shown you the framework. I've shown you that the framework changes when observers are performing each task. And I want to think now about different ways that you can read out information from these kinds of responses. So we came up with sort of 2 ways that this might work. One idea is that there's a fixed readout, and I'll define this for you. The idea in the fixed readout is that all the changes in the behavior have to come from these changes in sensitivity. The idea is those changes may be aggregated across all the different areas that we measured, might add up to be large enough to account for the behavior. And I'll walk you through the sort of quantitative model version of this in just a moment.
Would you call that an early selection model in the sense that Anthony asked about earlier?
Yes. So this is now, our fixed readout model is somewhat of an early selection model. Yeah. So you can compare that to the idea of a flexible readout. A flexible readout is one that allows you to change what areas you're reading out from. So when you're performing the contrast task, you might want to read out your information from areas that are sensitive to contrast. Whereas when you're performing the coherence task, you might want to read out your information from areas that are sensitive to coherence. So 2 different ways. And to tack onto these historical terms, this is kind of more of a late selection model in some sense. So what actually happened in the data? Oh, sorry, let me walk you through the specifics of the model so we're all on the same page. So the way the model works, the right dot patch causes a response in each of the different visual areas based on the contrast and the coherence of that patch. Left patch does the same. And what the model does is weight those areas by some set of weights that are going to change based on whether this is fixed or a flexible readout. Those weighted responses are summed together to get a summed response for the right dot patch and for the left. And to choose which side has higher contrast or coherence, you're comparing those responses. So you're subtracting right minus left. We account for other kinds of bias that observers might have. Some observers just hit the right button more often than the left. And then we take that total signal and we run it through a cumulative normal distribution, and that gets us back to the sigmoidal shape of the observer's actual behavior. This is the full model. The important part of the model are the weights. In the fixed readout model, we use the same weights for the contrast and coherence task. So any change in behavior has to come from change in these functions, depending on which task you're doing. In the flexible readout model, you're allowed to use different weights. You get to weight V1 when you're trying to do the contrast task, and you get to weight MT when you're trying to do the coherence task, or however it plays out when these parameters are fit to the data. Yeah?
Are the weights fit on a per subject basis or across the entire?
All the analysis we do, everything that I've shown you this whole time has been on a per subject basis, and then I'm showing you the averages of the per subject fits. And that'll be the same thing will be true here. So to get started.
Is that the whole thing on the model?
That's the whole model, yeah.
The weights are being fit simultaneously? I'm just trying to figure out if there's collinearity in the predictors, how does the variance get split, and how does the model handle all that?
Yeah, so there is collinearity. If you fit all 8 of these, then you have a huge collinearity problem. We fit a reduced model that just uses V1 and MT. It actually fits as well as the full model, and there's much less of a collinearity between just those 2 areas. But here I'm showing you the data from the full model fit. Okay, so to get started, I want to show you I want to give you a sense of how the model works by showing you a sort of baseline fit. This is the worst possible fit we could do. The reason it's the worst possible fit is because I'm taking the sensory responses when observers passively viewed the contrast and coherence dot patches. So these responses do not change based on task. They're just the same. And I'm going to fit them with a fixed readout, which is the same regardless of which task they're doing. So this model can only fit intermediate responses to the behavior. What the model's doing is fitting the same contrast sensitivity and coherence sensitivity curves for both tasks. The orange lines look the same, the purple lines look the same. So this is a null model in some sense. It's the worst you can do on this task.
What's the behavior that you're fitting to?
This is the same behavior I showed you before. It's the observers making judgments about which side's higher contrast or which side is higher coherence when there's those changes. No, here, this is the behavior, and separately I'm using responses that were measured while observers passively viewed the same stimulus. The next model we can fit is the fixed readout model. So here I'm taking the responses measured while observers perform the task, and I'm fitting them with this fixed readout. So any change in the behavior between the contrast task and the coherence task is going to be solely the result of changes in the representation, the changes in sensitivity that I showed you before. And we find that this model fits the behavior better. So the contrast sensitivity looks better in the contrast task. You're now insensitive to coherence, which is good. You're properly sensitive to coherence during the coherence task, but you still show sensitivity to contrast during the coherence task. So it's not perfect. And the interpretation here is that the changes in sensitivity that we measured are not enough to account for the behavior. It isn't until you let the model use a flexible readout where it can weight different areas that you can fit the behavior properly. It does miss one thing, and that's just a limitation of the data that we have. Yeah, Dan.
There's a fourth model that I wanted to ask about, which is the passive viewing with the flexible readout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that model fits the data perfectly.
So that's really like the weight selection.
Yeah, in some sense.
But are you going to show that? Or?
I'm not going to show those fits, but you can imagine it's the same thing here, but the yellow contrast sensitivity during the coherence task runs through the data points. So I want to show you these data in one slightly different way. This x-axis now is a measure of the quality of the fit. CD is like R squared, variance explained, but for tasks in which there's binary responses. So the baseline model across different observers fits with an average CD of about 0.2. It fits poorly. The fixed readout model fits better, but it's only the flexible readout model that sort of exceeds the fits of all of the other ones. And this is all the data we have across all the participants that we have. So that's the picture that we have. So what I've shown you here is that although the sensory representations change when observers are performing these two different tasks, it's not enough. So there were changes in the responses, but it wasn't enough to fit the data perfectly. The flexible readout does better. And so the way we're interpreting this is that the changes are insufficient, you need a flexible readout. And that's something we'd like to be able to measure someday, but it's hard to do that in human imaging. Earlier, I told you about the other task, the color estimation task. And there what I showed you was that selecting different features changed your bias, but not your sensitivity. The sensitivity was the same, the bias is the only thing that's changing. And I alluded to the idea that sensitivity might be linked to the representation, bias might be linked to the readout. So I think actually these two stories fit together somewhat nicely. In both cases, it seems like something about the way you're pulling information out is changing, and the actual representations themselves might not be the source of how attention works. That's not to say that there's no reason you ever would want to use a fixed readout. I don't want to make the claim that a flexible readout is just how attention works in all cases. If you go back to this example from the beginning, staring out your office window and watching yellow chickadees fly by, I think that if this is all you ever did in life, then a fixed readout is actually a good thing to do. The earlier you throw out the background information, the fact that you don't care about it, the earlier you do that, the more energy potentially you can save. It's more efficient to throw that information out, as long as nothing unexpected happens. As long as Seattle doesn't heat up and condors don't move to Seattle, and you have to observe different birds. And that's the whole picture of what I have. Thank you. I think it would be good to do questions first, and then I have some acknowledgments and thank yous to say after we have time for questions. Are we okay on time? Yeah.
How does the task performance change over the many hours are there noticeable differences, or does it saturate early?
Yeah, so the question is, over learning and over performing this task over many hours, does the task performance change? And the answer is yes, definitely. People get better, but they usually saturate pretty quickly in their performance. So all the data I've shown you is after observers were trained for at least an hour or 2 hours. And in most of these experiments, I have a check. So I check to see whether the performance, the confidence interval on someone's performance during one like 15-minute session is similar between 2 sessions in a row. That's the point that I say I'm collecting data, basically. Before that was training. Yeah, I see that.
So 2 questions. The first is, a question about your data. If I understand it correctly, you measured changes in the neural representation, and you suggested that it was linked to changes in sensitivity, but you don't see changes in sensitivity in your first task at least. And the second question has to do with the bias, and I was just wondering if you think how much of this bias is sort of like a memory confusion bias, because like the stimulus disappears when they make the response, right? So if you kept the stimulus there, do you think the bias would be similar?
Yeah, great. So I'll answer the second question and then go backwards. So there's actually another version of this task that I didn't mention here, where we ask observers to average the motion direction of 2 dot patches. And the reason we ran that was with this concern in mind. We wanted to make sure that when you select and do a perceptual task of some kind, you still get these same effects. And that seems to be consistent. So at least you get the same sensitivity effect, where your ability to average 2 motion directions is the same whether you pull those 2 dot patches out on the same side, or whether you pull them out by matched colors in that case. So there's 2 yellow patches, 2 blue ones. If you average the 2 yellow ones, you're just as good as if you average the 2 on the left. So about the neural representation question, so what we showed here is that we can measure changes in the sensory representation but they're small. And the piece that's missing here is the history. So people have been measuring changes in sensory representation during attention for a long time. And the changes tend to be small in general. And so I think our findings are really consistent with that. The difference here is that by using this linking model, we can show that the scale of the changes is not enough to account for behavior. Whereas most of the time that people study these kinds of things, they just do the correlation. They say switch what you're attending to, and they find that there's a change. But they don't get the scale right. They don't check whether or not the changes are the right magnitude. So that's
So
how
I
we're
guess my
thinking about
question
this.
was more linking it to D prime. Maybe it's trivial, maybe it's just that there's not enough of a change, but why is there no change in D prime if you potentially see a change in the representation?
Oh, it definitely accounts. So at the end, what I was showing you in these plots, I won't bring them up again, but the changes in the representation do account for a substantial portion of the behavior. So they do account for a change in D prime. They just don't account for all of it. Yeah, Tyler.
Could you speak a little bit about how you relate the model here with the learning you see across training? Do you think that it is learning of the linear, of the kind of flexible readout? And how long does it take for people to figure this out?
I'm not sure how that would work. So one limitation we have in this experiment is that to get enough data to be able to measure the representations at all, we're collecting hours of scanning. So I think the ideal way to answer your question would be to do this measurement twice and spend another few years in grad school. So measure it once before people have been trained and then measure it again after they've been trained and see what the change is. But I don't have that kind of data, and I'm not sure what it would look like. So I don't want to speculate too much about which of these changes accounts for the learning. Dan? Or Franco, if you want to.
Well, I guess you should get tenure at Stanford so that you do it multiple times during the learning.
Yeah, we could do a longitudinal study.
But
yeah.
a related question is, if you were to think about wiring a device that actually implements your learning, say like a network, right? What type of wires would you need to have, and what type of directionality of those wires? Normally we think about this visual cortex as being mostly feed-forward. You know, some of the work with Justin has been kind of pitching to the opposite. There's a lot of feedback, and where is this feedback coming out? Is it self-organizing locally? Is it coming from, is it fitting in from other area? How do you think about that in terms of the readout that you implement?
Yeah, so the question is, what kinds of connections would actually result in these kinds of changes? And I think that the place to look at for this is the literature on spatial attention. So the task in the beginning, when I asked you to select 2 dot patches on one side, that was spatial selection. And I think in the spatial attention literature, there's sort of the strongest examples of sort of solved mechanisms for how this might work. So there are areas in prefrontal cortex that are connected to the visual cortex, and that seem to drive small changes in the sensitivity in visual cortex that might then result in selection in the way that we're thinking about here. I should be a little careful because Tieran's sitting over there. So I think that the place to start with building a mechanistic model is actually not this motion visibility example, but building it for a spatial attention task. And that's actually something we're working on, is trying to figure out whether we can build a little mechanistic model of how that would play out. Yeah, Dan?
So just going back to the fourth model that wasn't mentioned, but we talked about a little bit, which was not looking at the passive viewing neural input and the flexible readout. You were saying that actually fit the data better. Would you say that the conclusion from that would be that somehow, could you conclude from that, or could you at least suggest that the actual system is somehow either not reading out
Yeah.
How do you make that consistent?
So I guess I think I want to say two things here. One is that I'm cautious about the interpretation of fitting the behavior to a set of data that was collected during what's realistically a different task. So when the observers are passively viewing the stimulus, they're doing something with the fixation cross, so they're looking for changes there. So I'm somewhat cautious about how much we should read into the fact that that model fits better.
It's not a physical model. It's not the actual thing that they're getting.
Yeah, so I'm more confident about the idea that when you're looking at the task responses and you compare the fixed and flexible readout, you do much better with the flexible readout.
But would you still have to say, though, there's something left to be explained, which is that there's a gap between the flexible readout model and behavior. So something has to be, even if you wouldn't say, okay, I agree with you, the passive viewing model is the correct model, but what do you think the correct model is?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of limitations and sort of caveats. One of them that really does matter here is the number of areas you allow the model to use. So that could be one explanation here. So if we had measured more areas, so I didn't say this, but the reason we've constrained to 8 areas is those are the 8 retinotopic areas that we could define in every observer. But that could have been 9. And it's possible that if we had collected 1 or 2 more or 5 or 10 more areas, then we would have found enough signals that adding them up would potentially work. I don't know for sure. And it goes the other way as well. If you just use V1 and MT, you actually do similarly well to the full model. And that suggests that potentially all you need for this task is V1 and MT, and that should be what we're focused on. And that's actually more consistent with the literature on contrast and coherence in the past. People have sort of focused on specific areas. So I think there's more to think about in terms of exactly which areas are being read out from. So?
I have a question, but it comes a bit from mouse world, not sort of this type of imaging data. So it could be completely off. And just feel free to say so. No need to be polite, right? So, when you speak often about representation, it's that when you do a bunch of population recordings in single units in an animal, then representation is not you can't define representation. You need to sort of pick a particular weighted sum across the neurons, which I imagine you could do with voxel. So I'm wondering if you try to take the opposite approach of assuming the representation has to explain it, and then trying to do something more subtle about the way you define representation in the data. Have you guys tried to push on that direction? Do you think it will sort things out? Or?
The question is whether we're thinking about representation the right way. So the way we're doing representation here is we're taking the average activity across each visual area and just assuming it's all the same. And we did look at whether there were differences across voxels, but partly because of the stimulus we're using, it's very large. The changes are quite dramatic. It drives sort of all the voxels in a similar way, as far as we can tell. So that's why we made that choice. For this task, I'm not sure. One thing that we would like to do is run this task with color and motion direction, which are stimuli that you need to pull out by thinking about this cross-voxel representation. So in that case, I think there might be more to think about there. But here, I think really the average is actually potentially the best signal to use. Maybe we have time for one more? Yeah, so this will have to be the last question, I think. Yeah, great. So you're pushing me to speculate actually on the tier. I think the most I want to speculate is that my suspicion here is that it's really just a few areas that matter. And probably really V1 and MT and maybe one or a few other areas like that, from which you're pulling out all the information. I think adding more areas just gives you more correlated signals, and you saturate in performance to do that. I don't have a graph showing that there's a saturating function, but I'm 99% sure that that's what it would be. So before everybody heads out, I want to say a few quick thank yous to people who've had a big impact on my graduate career, in particular, Justin. And rather than just say thank you a million times, I want to tell you a little story. So this is a hallway in Jordan Hall, and there's a very dim light running across the ground here that you can probably just barely see. And this little light has become extremely important to me in the last 5 years. And as a vision scientist, one of the things that happens is you look at Gabor's a lot, and your visual system gets good at detecting oriented bars of light. And I've gotten very good at this detecting problem. And the reason for that is because that bar of light is Justin's door being open. And I got to Stanford 5 years ago. I was the only person in the lab, and Justin left his door open all the time, which was great for me. I was able to go in and read papers with Justin. We talked about experiments endlessly. I had a lot of bad ideas at the time that have, I think, maybe gotten better. And over 5 years, Justin's door has stayed open. I took this picture on Tuesday or Monday, and the door's still open. And the fact that after such a long time, Justin doesn't keep his door closed and try to keep me from barging in constantly really means a lot to me. Being able to walk into your office and talk to you at any time has been, I think, the kind of single most important thing for the way that I do science and think about research. So thank you, and thank you for everything else, of course. I want to thank my other committee members as well. So when I got to Stanford, one of the first things that happened was Cameleon invited me to join her lab meeting for a year, and that gave me such a different perspective. Being the only person in the lab for a long time was fun and interesting, but being surrounded by a community of people turned out to be a really important thing for grad school. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for pulling me into the vision community in the last 2 years. Together with Tony and Calamity and Justin and Brian and the other Vision Brunch faculty, we have a little community, and it's been nice. It's been wonderful to be a part of that. I want to thank Tony for also leaving his door open. Tony is my next door neighbor in the offices, and I can sneak in there and ask him quickly questions about all the little details of things that I don't know about EEG, about much more vision science than I'm actually aware of at this point. And it's been really helpful. I really appreciated it. I want to thank Tiran for joining my committee a few years ago. I don't know that much about monkeys, but I can walk a reasonably far distance to Tiran's office and ask him questions about monkeys, and that's turned out to be really helpful, and it's also pushed me to think about going into animal research, which is now my plan. So thank you for keeping your office open and for weighing in on how other brains work in my research. And Shaul, thanks for joining at the last minute. And actually, when you came to give an NBC talk was one of the first times I saw a sort of mouse data talk that really convinced me that mouse research was a place that I could figure out answers to questions about attention that I couldn't do in humans, potentially. So thanks for encouraging that kind of direction of research. I have a lot of other people to thank, my many lab mates in particular, Min Young and Steve, and Guillaume and Akshay, who've been here for most of the last 5 years and really influenced our lab environment and our lab meetings and the way we think about papers. And Mega and Josh and Cam, who's been gone for a long time. It's been nice to have a group of people to be surrounded with. I didn't spend a lot of grad school in the lab. I spent a lot of grad school in the mountains, and I'm really lucky to have old friends and new friends who I'm able to just go out and climb with and spend time outdoors. It's been a wonderful distraction from, grad school's hard, and these experiences have just been wonderful experiences for me to get me out of the lab. In particular, I wanted to emphasize Andrew, who's been a wonderful climbing partner for the last year, and Mona. The three of us have had a lot of fun climbing around California and exploring this place. And Robert too. I know Robert's gone at this point, but and Corey, who's teaching rock climbing neuroscience with me this summer, and Daniel. It's been wonderful to have a community separate from grad school at Stanford. It's been really important for me. I want to thank my cohort. It's been fun. In particular, Kara's not my cohort, but Kara, Sophia, and MH, who I lived with for a year, it was huge to go from not coming home to grad students who were also suffering through grad school to coming home and being able to talk to other grad students about the experience. But the person in my cohort who's had the most influence on my research and has weighed in on every aspect of every project that I've done, every word that I told you today has gone through Ian's ears first. Thank you, Ian, for Tony knows. Thanks, Ian. I want to thank my family as well, and in big part because I come from a professor dynasty. There's a lot of professors and doctorates in my family, and I've always sort of assumed that I would go to grad school, and I've realized over time that that was a huge privilege to be able to make that assumption that I would get to this point in my life. So thank you for supporting me on whatever path I chose, and it happens to be the path that everyone else chose too. And the last person I want to thank, I want to tell a very quick story, and then we'll get everybody out of here. So grad school's hard. Experiments fail, hard things happen, you struggle for weeks with ideas and back and forth with your advisor and the other people that you talk to. And there's high points. Last year I had the first half of this project published, and actually tomorrow the other half will be published. But the most struggle I experienced during grad school, and on the same day, the most joy I experienced during grad school were the day that we got engaged on a mountain and then got epically lost on the way down. It was like 12 hours of walking through the forest, and it was such a dismal experience. It was so much worse than anything that's happened in grad school. And I really appreciate having that perspective. Thanks so much, everyone.